If you're only walking 10,000 steps a day, frankly, you're not doing enough daily walking. It's certainly not enough to give you the longevity benefits, and ultimately, it's not going to help you avoid living a sedentary life like many of you are already experiencing at the moment. 10,000 steps a day is just about 100 minutes of walking. That's like an hour and 40 minutes of walking, which means that for the other 14 hours and 20 minutes or so, you're basically just sitting around, being as sedentary as ever and opening yourself up to the risk of developing metabolic syndrome diseases like heart disease, high cholesterol, diabetes, and even cancer. 10,000 steps is going to be the bare minimum in order to be considered a pretty active individual. In fact, if you were to go on a calorie calculator and looked at your activity level, someone only walking 10,000 steps a day probably has an average activity level. They're not active daily, they're active some of the time. And this might come as a shock to most of you, since this is oftentimes the advice that's peddled to most people when it comes to daily walking or having a respectable step count. 10,000 steps was actually a marketing ploy that was developed by a Japanese odometer company. So this was a company that created a device and they wanted a way to sell this device. So they pitched 10,000 steps as this gold standard number for everyone to achieve through daily walking. So as a result, this Japanese company sold a lot of these odometers, and people got bamboozled into thinking that as long as they're walking 10,000 steps, they were fairly active. They were getting the fat loss, the longevity, and the non-sedentary benefits from just knocking out 10,000 steps. But 10,000 steps, and you're going to learn this pretty early on, especially if you're not already walking anywhere close to 10,000 steps. 100 minutes of walking is barely going to burn any calories throughout the day. At the start, 10,000 steps will probably allow you to burn about 250 calories, give or take. But eventually, your body enters a state which is known as metabolic adaptation, which means that, quite simply, your body gets used to a certain activity or gets used to a certain way of you doing things. In this case, 10,000 steps, it's going to say, okay, I'm used to this guy walking 10,000 steps. So you're suddenly not going to be burning 250 calories. You're going to be burning a lot less than 250 calories just from walking 10,000 steps. Eventually, you're going to have to start walking a lot more than 10,000 steps to get those fat loss benefits and to get those longevity benefits. In terms of longevity, there was a study that I read not too long ago where they looked at different groups of people. One group of people was, your typical sedentary population. They spend most of their days sitting down. They were working at a desk. They had like an office job. And then after finishing up work, they would just come home, just sit on the couch and watch TV and be as sedentary as ever. So they probably had even less than 6,000 steps a day. There was another group who was considered to be this highly active group, and they were actually well over 10,000 steps a day. In fact, the top performers, quote unquote, of this group, they were actually hitting well over 16,000 steps a day. That's right. Well above 10,000 steps, nearing about 20,000 steps a day. But on average, this group walked about 16,000 steps a day, which is about 160 minutes, give or take, right? If you're assuming an average walking speed of about 2 miles per hour. So they went back and looked at the morbidity and mortality of all of these participants. So the sedentary participants eventually, after a certain age, and this was tracked over a certain number of years, I think that this was like a decade plus of data that they had on all of these guys. But anyway, the sedentary group of participants, they unfortunately, almost all of them, developed various metabolic syndrome disorders. So they developed, unfortunately, heart disease. Almost all of them had high blood pressure. They had high cholesterol, high triglyceride counts. They were all overweight. They all had a BMI of well over 25. Most of them had a BMI of over 30. So the sedentary population predictably became sick after a certain number of decades, especially after they crossed age 45. The second group, the more active group, especially those among that more active group that are walking over 16,000 steps, what they noticed in that group was maybe a couple of these folks had some minor like age-related symptoms, but for the most part, their average blood pressure and their blood tests, which tracked things like their cholesterol level, both good and bad cholesterol, so LDL, HDL, triglycerides. Basically, they did a lipid panel. They also looked at their CBC, or their complete blood cell count. And very interestingly enough, these participants didn't develop any metabolic syndrome disorder. So they ended up not getting heart disease or seeing any risk factors for heart disease. Certainly no signs of hypercholesterolemia in their blood either. And they also didn't develop diabetes or even cancer. In fact, that same population of really active individuals went on to live on average about 11 years more than the population that was sedentary. 11 years was basically the added life expectancy of these participants that walked well over 16,000 steps. So as you can see, there is a clear longevity benefit, and this is just one study. There have been other studies that have been repeated across the world. I believe this study was conducted in the UK, if I'm not mistaken. This was done in the UK. There might have been a couple of studies that were conducted in the United States, but for the most part, studies like this established a clear longevity link or correlation between daily walking, especially high volume daily walking, and life expectancy. And on average, folks that walked over 16,000 steps a day lived longer than their sedentary counterparts. In fact, they lived about 11 years on average longer than people who walk way less than 16,000. And as I mentioned at the start, they walked even less than 6,000 steps a day, or an hour of walking a day. So if you're just walking 10,000 steps a day, you're basically, 6,000 steps away from 16,000? So you're walking basically an hour less than you would to actually get the longevity benefit, which is living on average 11 years more than someone who doesn't do a lot of walking. So by essentially walking 10,000 steps a day, you're not too far away from that sedentary group of participants who develop metabolic disorder. So that's a longevity benefit from walking 10,000 steps that you won't get. And then the third problem with walking only 10,000 steps a day is that we mentioned at the start fat loss benefit. We just walked over or talked a little bit about longevity. The third thing that you're going to miss out on if you don't walk 10,000 steps a day is that you're going to be more severely affected by metabolic adaptation. Eventually, especially when you're in a calorie deficit, you're going to start losing less calories. Your body's going to want to hold on to more fat, right? You're going to be more likely to lose less fat the further along you continue in your calorie deficit. And as a result, you're going to start dipping below 10,000 steps automatically. Your NEAT or your non-exercise activity thermogenesis is going to start to go way down. And when that decreases, your body unfortunately is going to force you to stop walking as much. So you're going to go from 10,000 and start to gradually decrease down to 9,000, 8,000, 7,000. Eventually, you're going to be even worse than that sedentary group of participants who develop metabolic syndrome, right? You're not even going to be close to 6,000 steps. So that's something that happens if you set your sights so low as to just go for 10,000 steps a day, which, as I mentioned, is just a bare minimum for fat loss, for longevity, and ultimately to stay lean year round. So what do I recommend? I recommend that if you want to get all the benefits that I discussed at a pretty high level in this video, right? I could talk about this for hours, talk about exactly how many steps you should be walking every single day. But one recommendation I'd like to make right now is take a look at the description and take a look at the second AI prompt that I have down below. That second AI prompt, if you type in some of your information like your age, your gender, your current activity level, how many steps you're currently walking, for example, that's going to give you a pretty good indication of how many steps you should be walking in order to actually have fat loss occurring just through walking alone. Because as I mentioned, you can actually have a calorie deficit both ways. You can introduce a calorie deficit by eating less food, and you can have a calorie deficit by increasing your activity level, aka increasing your step count. So this second AI prompt is going to help you estimate exactly how much walking you need to be doing in order to burn more calories. So for many of you who are barely doing any walking at all at the moment, 10,000 steps might be a very good initial goal to hit. So by walking 10,000 steps, you might burn an additional 250 calories. Eventually, right around the time that metabolic adaptation kicks in, you're going to want to increase it at 10,000. You want to gradually add on 30 more minutes of walking every 2 to 3 weeks. So that would mean, for example, another 30 minutes of walking would transform your daily step goal from 10,000 to 13,000 steps a day. And eventually, maybe 3 to 4 weeks later, you would bump that up to another extra 30-minute walk that you can add on sometime during your day and bump that up from 13,000 to 16,000. I want you all to gradually increase your step count from 10,000 to the point that over 6 months to a year of consistently walking over 10,000 steps a day, now you're crossing into the 20,000 step category. You're essentially becoming a high volume daily walker who can confidently and consistently walk over 20,000 steps a day. I did that back in 2024. Right before 2024, I was actually averaging over 10,000 steps. But gradually, as I became accustomed to walking 10,000 steps, as I gradually integrated walking into all of my daily activities, right? When I started walking during phone calls with family members, during work meetings, conference meetings, while watching TV, while playing video games, while just going out for walks in nature, I started to very quickly increase my step count. 12,000, 15,000, 16,000, and eventually by the end of 2023 and early 2024, now I was consistently hitting 20,000 steps. It didn't feel like a chore at all, right? It became as commonplace as walking 10,000 steps was back in 2023. Now, after walking over 20,000 steps for over a year now, if you saw my first video, you can see that I've stepped up my goal from 20,000 steps a day to now over 30,000 steps a day. So now I can consistently cross over 30,000 steps a day. I've had actually a couple of 40,000 step days. I think my all-time high was about 44,000, 45,000 steps. So you can say that I've been basically kicking metabolic adaptation over and over again, trying to defeat it, trying to prevent that from potentially causing me to decrease my step count automatically, as it so happens, especially during a calorie deficit. And many of you watching these videos are in dire need of doing a calorie deficit, right? This might be the very first time you do a calorie deficit. So why don't you make it easy on yourself, and instead of burning all your calories through eating less food, instead of potentially starving yourself, why not pair prolonged starvation with increased daily walking, right? Start off with 10,000 steps if you aren't already walking 10,000 steps. If you've never in your life achieved a 10,000 step day, look at your current step goal. And if you don't have a step goal, start off at 30 minutes of walking a day, and then gradually over a period of weeks to maybe a month or so, increase that, double that, to from half an hour walking a day to an hour walking a day. And then gradually, as you begin to integrate walking into your daily activities, it'll become much, much easier to increase that step goal over time. And I'm actually gonna put on my glasses at this point or my specs, my sunglasses, because it started to get a little hot, right? There you go. So it's gonna become easier over time for you all to start increasing your step goal, to the point that you'll be eventually hitting 20,000 steps a day like moi. Typical ambulance. So 10,000 steps, good starting point. Definitely not a goal, definitely not a destination for any viewer of this channel. And if you want to learn about more ways about how you can automatically, in pretty much on autopilot, achieve 10,000, 20,000, and like me, over 30,000 steps a day, keep watching more videos. Subscribe to the channel and you'll learn exactly how to become a high volume daily walker like moi. So 10,000 steps, that's just a bare minimum. 10,000 steps is for losers. 20,000, 30,000 steps, that's how you stay lean for life.